Welcome to a videotaped installment of the Canadian Society for Civil Engineering 2024-25 National Tech Talk webinars. This webinar, recorded on November 27th, 2024, features Kevin Baskin and Mike Bartlett of the CSCE's National History Committee presenting A.B. Sanderson and J.A. Vance, esteemed CSCE Award namesakes. The webinar host is Ali Mahmoud.
Good day all. Welcome to today's CSCE National Tech Talk webinar. I'm Ali Mahmoud, Chair of the CSCE National History Committee. I'll be your moderator for the next hour. Now, we have a very busy hour planned. We'll start with a brief introduction to the CSCE. We'll then display the first of two code words that you can use to apply for a Professional Development Hour certificate for attending this webinar. We'll then introduce our speakers, Kevin Baskin and Mike Bartlett. They will make a presentation on A.B. Sanderson and J.A. Vance, two esteemed CSCE Award namesakes. We'll then have a question and answer session. And finally, before we wrap up, we'll display the second PDH certificate code word. CSCE has been around since 1887. Our mission is to be a not-for-profit learned society that develops and maintains high standards of civil engineering practice in Canada and enhances the public image of the civil engineering profession. We also have a very active National History Committee. If you want more information or would like to attend any of our monthly meetings, please email me at either of these two email addresses. My pleasure to introduce our presenters, Kevin Baskin and Mike Bartlett. Both are very active members of the National History Committee. Kevin is the past Chief Bridge Engineer for the BC Ministry of Transportation and Transit in Victoria, where he currently works part-time. He chairs the National History Committee's Indigenous Perspectives Task Group. Mike is a Professor Emeritus of Civil and Environmental Engineering at Western, current CSCE Vice President, Administration Coordinating Committee. Upon his retirement in 2019, he earned a Master of Arts in History from Western, and he is the past chair of the CSCE National History Committee, a new member of the ASCE History and Heritage Committee, and chair designate of the American Concrete Institute's Committee 120 History of Concrete. Kevin and Mike, the floor is yours. Please proceed.
Thanks, Ali. I'm really happy to be able to present some information about A.B. Sanderson. I learned about his history here in British Columbia and his accomplishments in bridge engineering that are really quite remarkable. And his accomplishments are not just here in BC, but all across Canada. And so I'm really happy to be able to present some information on this today. Every year, the CSCE celebrates achievements of its members, named for its awards, named for eminent Canadian civil engineers. And some of these engineers are quite well known and have a lot documented on them. For example, the Dictionary of Canadian Biography has excellent descriptions of Casimir Zowski and Sanford Fleming, Walter Shanley, Thomas Kiefer. However, there are also lesser known engineers who haven't had much documented or about their careers, in particular Donald Jameson, Gordon Pluis, Peter M. Wright, E. Whitman Wright. And it's an ongoing initiative of the CSCE National History Committee to research these individuals and to prepare short biographies about them. And so today, we're going to be briefly sharing some research on two of these eminent CSCE Award namesakes, Adrian Barclay Sanderson. I'll talk about him, structural engineer from Victoria, BC, and then I'll turn things over to Mike, who will talk about James A. Vance, a civil engineer from Woodstock, Ontario. Adrian Barclay Sandy Sanderson truly was an esteemed structural engineer and worthy of being the namesake for the annual CSCE A.B. Sanderson Award. I want to start off by acknowledging the co-authors of the paper that was used in the preparation of this presentation, Mike Bartlett, who's the chair of the CSCE National History Committee, and Kelsey Walker of the Macdonald-Laurier Institute, who worked as a history intern for the CSCE National History Committee and gathered background information for this paper. The CSC annually presents the A.B. Sanderson Award to recognize outstanding contributions by a civil engineer to the development and practice of structural engineering in Canada. And Sandy Sanderson's career and his outstanding contributions are truly worthy of having this award named in his honor. This is a one-pager overview slide that I put together of some of the outstanding contributions that Sandy Sanderson made. He was a prolific designer of major highway and railway bridges in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s. He was the designer of the first pre-stressed concrete highway bridge in Canada in 1952. He was the technical advisor to the Royal Commission of Inquiry into the collapse of the Second Narrows Bridge in 1958. He was chairman of the board for the reconstruction of the Peace River Bridge at Taylor, BC on the Alaska Highway after the collapse of the World War II suspension bridge that had been built there. He was the designer for the longest span girder bridge in North America at the time in 1965. He specialized in design of domes for astronomical observatories. He was the designer for some unique building structures here in Victoria, BC. And for all, he was really a visionary, innovator, thinker, builder, and a believer in the virtues of progress. He was a prolific writer of papers on a wide variety of topics, and he had roles on professional bodies and technical committees. The presentation today will go through his early life and career, his work with the BC Department of Public Works Bridge Branch, the company that he founded in 1955, A.B. Sanderson and Company, his merger with Kerr Priestman and Associates Limited in 1971, and some of his other notable collaborations, including collaboration with P.L. Prattley, a little bit more on his observatories and papers and roles. Born in England in 1909, Sanderson and family moved to Canada in 1919 and to Victoria in 1923. He graduated from UBC in civil engineering in 1933, having taken some time out to work for Dominion Bridge, which was a company he would have many interactions with extensively over his career and the many bridges that he was involved in. His early career, Sanderson had a strong professional relationship with Philip Prattley, who was arguably the most renowned bridge engineer in Canada at that time. And it may have been Sanderson's work with Dominion Bridge where he first interacted with Prattley. After he graduated, Sanderson worked for Canadian Industries Limited, CIL, at their explosives plant on James Island near Victoria, BC. He then joined the Navy in World War II and was the first officer on the HMCS Mono. After the war, he joined the BC Department of Public Works Bridge Branch in 1945 and worked there for 10 years in the roles of Chief Design Engineer and Assistant Bridge Engineer. Assistant Bridge Engineer was the second most senior position in the department at that time. While there, he was a key player in numerous significant bridges and innovations. This included what's on the screen now, the design of the first pre-stressed concrete highway bridge in Canada, the Mosquito Creek Bridge in North Vancouver, which had a span of 18 meters. Design of this bridge required the solution of 20 simultaneous equations to determine the lateral load distribution of the bridge deck, and all done by hand at that time. Quite an impressive feat. There was also a load test that was undertaken to determine the behavior and the ultimate capacity of the stringer, given that this was in the early days of pre-stressed concrete. Sanderson determined that the design of the bridge should be based on 1.1 times the dead load plus 4.4 times the live load. And this is a criteria that was similar to what was later adopted by ASHO. There's a picture of Sanderson with the red circle around watching the load test. Another major bridge that he led at Public Works was the Agassiz-Rosedale Bridge. This bridge also demonstrated innovation through the use of a proprietary design system called pre-packed concrete, It was a technique for the construction of the river pier foundations, also known as Disney piers. It was a system that used grout intrusion of aggregate placed surrounding the H-piles in an excavated but not a dewatered casing. Sanderson was involved in the design of this while he was with the Public Works, and then when he started up his own firm, his company got the contract to do all the supervision and construction engineering work. Sanderson left Public Works and started up his own consulting company in 1955. It became a prolific designer of a diversity of highway and railway bridges that opened up the interior of British Columbia. He started with a 9-person office in Victoria and then also opened an office in Vancouver that did the non-bridge structure designs for the company. He had a philosophy that the design of bridges and the buildings should not be mixed in the same office. This slide shows the Paulson Bridge in the Kootenays in southeast BC near Christina Lake, and it's an example of the type of major bridge that his firm did the designs for, this one in 1966. We'll go through another series of slides quickly here that are also intended to give a bit of an overview of the type of major bridges that his firm completed in the late 50s and the early 60s. It really is remarkable how many major bridges they designed in such a short period of time. This first slide is the Cantilever Through Truss Nelson Bridge, also known as BOB, B-O-B, Big Orange Bridge, due to its paint color painted orange. Ramsay Murray, who's another significant engineer in British Columbia, worked for Sanderson before eventually starting up his own firm. And Ramsay was the resident engineer on site for the construction of the Nelson Bridge. East Pine Rail Bridge, 1957. It's an example of the type of bridge that Sanderson's company did. They did many railway bridges. The railway companies were a significant client for him. So this is just one of many. Sanderson continued to pioneer the design of pre-stressed girders in BC after designing the Mosquito Creek Bridge. He designed the pre-stressed girders for the approach spans for the Second Narrows Bridge, now known as the Ironworkers Memorial Bridge. This picture on the screen is the Nechako River Bridge, which is another example of one of his designs with pre-stressed concrete girders in 1958. Sanderson designed several major arch bridges over rivers in BC, including this Chilcotin Bridge, 1961, over the Fraser River, just north of Williams Lake. 145-meter main span steel arch bridge, still in service today. Another slide of the type of variety of railway bridges that he did. On the left, there's the Peace River PGE Railway Bridge, 1957, another truss bridge. He also did smaller type bridges. On the right-hand side, you'll see some plate girder and reinforced concrete rigid frame bridges in West Vancouver from 1955 era. His photo shows an example of the type of artist renderings that would be done in the day to showcase what bridges would look like, along with a photo of the actual completed bridge shortly after it was constructed. This is the Simon Fraser Bridge in Prince George, BC, also still in service today. The Alexandra Bridge over the Fraser River on the Trans-Canada Highway near Spuzzum, BC is another impressive arch designed by Sanderson. He was a strong advocate of electronic computation in structural design, and this project used a Allwack 3E computer at the University of British Columbia and combined with the theory of thin rods naturally curved for the arch design. The bridge was originally designed and tendered as a fixed arch. However, during construction, it was found that the bedrock was much deeper than anticipated, actually too deep to excavate down to. And so the arch had to be revised to a 2-hinged arch. And the 150 to 200 feet of sand and gravel that was above the bedrock below the foundation had to be pre-stressed to preload it and to reduce the amount of settlement and rotation at the foundation of the arch. And the scheme for the pre-stressing and preloading was developed working with Hugh Golder. As I mentioned earlier, not all of his projects were in British Columbia. The MacDonald-Cartier Bridge between Ottawa and Gatineau was designed using haunch steel box girders. And at the time, it was the longest girder span bridge in North America at 159-meter span. Sanderson had a strong professional relationship with P.L. Prattley, and Prattley considered Sanderson his representative in British Columbia. After Prattley passed away in August 1958, Sanderson inherited two significant projects. The first one, Sanderson became the expert engineering advisor, replacing Prattley for the Royal Commission of Inquiry on the collapse of the Second Narrows Bridge. And secondly, he became the replacement for Prattley as the chair of the board responsible for the reconstruction of the Taylor Bridge across the Peace River on the Alaska Highway in British Columbia, when the suspension bridge that had been built there during World War II collapsed due to a slope failure at the north abutment. On the left-hand side, you can see the photo that was taken while the suspension bridge was collapsing. And on the right-hand side, you see the replacement bridge that was designed by Sanderson. And also this bridge is still in service today. He developed a specialty in the designs of domes for astronomical observatories, and this is a photo of the observatory in Victoria, BC. He also did the design work starting in 1963 for the Mount Cobo Observatory that was proposed in the South Okanagan of BC. Near Penticton. This project was cancelled, however, in 1968 and was never built. In 1971, A.B. Sanderson and Company Limited merged with Kerr Priestman Associates and formed the Bridge and Structures division of that firm. And Sanderson was a principal and continued his career there until his retirement. I thought it would be interesting to highlight some of his other contributions other than his design work. He developed professional and personal relationships with many other engineers of note, including Ralph Freeman of Freeman Fox and Partners, Frank Masters of Majeski and Masters, Hugh Golder of Golder Associates, Colonel Swan from Swan Mooster, Thomas Blench of Edmonton, who was an expert in hydraulics and river engineering at the University of Alberta. And Sanderson was also a strong advocate and early adopter of computer design and use of in-office computers. He was also a founding partner of another consulting firm called Pathfinder Engineering that was formed in 1956 with McElhaney and others to carry out survey and civil engineering in remote areas of Canada and abroad. And he was the president of this company as well. It's noted that in the day, bridge engineers not only did the design of structural aspects of bridges, but they were also responsible for hydrotechnical aspects and other aspects. And Sanderson developed specialized knowledge in river channel stability, deep water piers, scour, and ice forces on structures. And he was a prolific writer and wrote technical articles and gave presentations on a wide variety of topics that he became specialized in, and some of these are just listed on the slide here. He was also an early promoter of a submerged floating tunnel from Victoria to Vancouver, and he worked on concepts and lobbied for this starting in the early 1960s. He insisted that one day this would be built, although he acknowledged that it would not be in his lifetime. This is still being talked about today. He was active in professional and technical community on numerous committees, and actually he became the president of the Association of Professional Engineers of BC in 1962. He was on the Bridge Code Committee and the Welding Committee and so forth. So in closing, Sanderson really did have a remarkable career in so many ways. For being a visionary and achiever, for contributions in landmark designs and innovations, for contributions to technical and professional bodies, for advancing knowledge through technical papers and presentations, and for his contributions to the development of the province of British Columbia. He truly is deserving of having the CSCE A.B. Sanderson Award named in his honor. I gratefully acknowledge the work done by the other co-authors, Mike Bartlett and Kelsey Walker. Also, thanks to Jivan Johal, who visited the archives of the BC Professional Engineer, Chris Sanderson for talking to us about his father's career, Ramsey Murray, who worked with Sandy Sanderson and who provided personal records that were used in this presentation, George Prince, who also worked with A.B. Sanderson throughout his career, who established the A.B. Sanderson bonds at the Royal BC Museum Archives, and to the CSE Foundation and the CSE History Program Fund that supported Kelsey Walker's research work while she was an intern for the National History Committee. That ends my portion of the presentation, and I'll pass it over to Mike.
Thanks very much, Kevin. You're right on time, so thank you. That's really nice. Kevin mentioned the Mosquito Creek Bridge. I'm embarrassed to admit that for 4 years, I walked across that bridge twice a day from our apartment in North Vancouver to the Buckland and Taylor offices without realizing anything about its historic significance. So there's a lesson to be learned there. Today, I'm talking about James A. Vance, who was born in a very rural community near Punky Doodle's Corners and became quite nationally prominent, mostly with the Engineering Institute of Canada, but he was a strong proponent of the Canadian Society for Civil Engineering as well. So the presentation is a short biography of James Alfred Vance. Since 1977, the CSCE has awarded the James A. Vance Award annually to recognize, quote, a CSCE member whose dedicated service, other than as president, has furthered the advancement of the CSCE and who has completed or recently completed service in one or more sequential positions at the national level. So today's presentation will focus on some of his career highlights. As a contractor, as president of the Engineering Institute of Canada, a strong supporter of Western engineering, where I'm speaking to you from, and as a member and later chair of the Ontario Water Resources Commission. We'll close by reflecting briefly on his achievements. So this map shows the birthplace of James A. Vance in East Zora Township between Tavistock and Punky Doodle's Corner. So that red square is the farm of his grandfather, Joseph Robert Vance, 1833 to 1918, and that's where Vance was born. For those of you who aren't from this part of the world, we're probably about 20 kilometers west of Kitchener-Waterloo in this little red square. And I actually, if I'm driving from here to the University of Waterloo, I take back roads and go through Punky Doodle's Corners. This is the Vance family tree, 2 generations of it. Vance described his father, James Armstrong Vance, as, quote, a farmer who became active in the erection of steel highway bridges with the Stratford Bridge Company of Stratford and the Hamilton Bridge Company of Hamilton. His mother, Ella Amelia Cooper, bore 7 children: May Cooper, Alan, Ernest, James Alfred, Joseph James, Robert, and Jean Armstrong. You can see that infant mortality was prevalent in those days. Both Alan and Ernest, who would have been James's elder brothers, passed away prematurely. Vance's autobiography, which I'm very grateful to Keith Stevens, who's on the call, for sharing, says that he entered the School of Practical Science at the University of Toronto in 1911. That's not quite true. It had been incorporated into the Faculty of Applied Science and Engineering in 1906, but it was known colloquially as the School of Practical Science for many years. Many eminent civil engineers graduated from the School of Practical Science, including Frank Barber, George Herrick Duncan, who was the lead guy at Dominion Bridge, and William G. Swan, who Kevin mentioned as a colleague and contemporary of A.B. Sanderson. I love the picture from the yearbook of 1913. Note there's a complete lack of safety gear in the picture. The worker on the beam is saying, quote, I wouldn't ride on one of them airy planes on a bet. So airy planes were brand new in 1913. 1914 was a tumultuous year for Vance. He joined the Canadian Society of Civil Engineers as a student member, noting that it was the outstanding organization for engineers in 1914. The Engineering Institute of Canada hadn't been formed. It appeared in 1917. But the unexpected death of his father meant that, well, it was a shock. And it, quote, as the oldest boy in the family, it was necessary that I leave university and then assume responsibility for my father's business, which was J.A. Vance Construction Limited, and our family. This was a heavy burden for one my age, The First World War started a few months later. Because of these home responsibilities, I did not serve in the First World War. We're not quite sure how Vance was able to become a registered professional engineer without actually completing his program at the University of Toronto, but somehow he managed to do that. The J.A. Vance Construction Company was founded by Vance's father and was soon erecting bridges that probably looked a lot like these. This is a typical Stratford Bridge Company bridge, the Water Street Bridge over Trout Creek in St. Mary's. And this is the Meadow Lily Bridge, which was fabricated by the Hamilton Bridge Company. These two are quite close to where I live in London. Vance guided the company to the construction of industrial facilities in Woodstock, such as the Standard Tube Company on the left and the Eureka Foundry and Manufacturing Company on the right. I gather from Keith Stevens that the Vance Construction Company not only built these facilities, but may have maintained the equipment in these facilities as well. Just prior to assuming office as EIC president, Vance and EIC secretary Austin L. Wright represented Canada at the Commonwealth Conference of Engineering Societies held at Johannesburg, South Africa, 11th to 20th April 1950. Representatives from Canada, New Zealand, Australia, and South Africa, and the United Kingdom agreed on several resolutions. For example, that membership should require, quote, a reasonable period of ordered practical training in or on engineering works. And, quote, except in very special circumstances, the constituent institution should aim at requiring a test by examination for associate membership. So, yeah, there's Vance right there. In 1950, Vance was installed as president at the EIC annual general meeting in Montreal. The guest speaker at his inauguration was the Honorable Lester B. Pearson, who's in the middle foreground, then Secretary of State for Foreign Affairs, later Prime Minister of Canada. As president, Vance visited 31 of the 32 EIC branches, including the inaugural meeting of the Belleville branch, shown on the right, where the Belleville branch received its charter. Mrs. Vance accompanied him on most of these visits, and they must have eaten a lot of rubber chicken in the process. Notice in the photograph on the left, Vance is at the right-hand side of that photograph. Notice how tall he is. He's about a head over just about everybody else in the room. Vance was awarded honorary life membership in the Engineering Institute of Canada in 1959. He was made an honorary member of the American Society of Civil Engineers in 1974, possibly as a consequence of his initiative and endowment to establish ASCE's Can-Am Enmity Award in 1972. I mentioned Western Engineering. Here's the London Free Press photograph of the opening of the Spencer Engineering Building, where I am sitting right now, on 30th of October, 1959. The Free Press reported, quote, a well-known conservationist, not a contractor, not an engineer, a well-known conservationist snipped the traditional purple and white ribbon across the entrance to the building before a small crowd thick with his professional brothers. Vance hailed the engineering science building as, quote, a faculty which will provide greater opportunities to the young people of Western Ontario. So Western was actually the third engineering school to open in Ontario after the University of Toronto, #1, and Queen's #2. And the University of Ottawa opened at the same time that Western did. Vance was awarded an honorary degree that day with 3 of his colleagues. So here they are. The other key player in establishing Western's Faculty of Engineering Science was E.V. Buchanan, and he was granted an honorary degree at the first engineering convocation the previous year in 1958. So from left to right, we've got Henri Godefroy, who was then Dean of Engineering at École Polytechnique in Montreal, Richard L. Hearn, who retired as Chief Engineer of the Hydroelectric Power Commission of Ontario. He was made an honorary member of EIC, the highest form of recognition within the gift of the Institute, in 1960. And then Vance, and then on the right is Kenneth Franklin Tupper, who was an aeronautical nuclear engineer at the National Research Council, who became the 5th Dean of Applied Science and Engineering at the University of Toronto. He was president of EIC in 1958, and after World War II served as director of the engineering division at the Chalk River Atomic Energy Project, overseeing the startup and operation of Canada's first nuclear reactor, the NRX. So this is a very prestigious group of individuals to be affiliated with. Vance was named member and later chair of the Ontario Water Resources Commission. I really love it when one historical figure collides with another. So here as advisor to the committee was Dr. Albert E. Berry, who then was director of the Division of Sanitary Engineering of the Ontario Department of Health. So the CSCE's Albert E. Berry Medal, awarded annually to recognize significant contributions in environmental engineering, is named in honor of Dr. Berry. Dr. Berry is another one of these guys that we need to find out more about and write up. Vance became chair of the Ontario Water Resources Commission from 64 to 69. Basically, the commission was tasked with creating water distribution and water treatment, sewage treatment infrastructure across Ontario, using a self-funding model where money would be loaned to the municipalities to build the infrastructure, and then the money would be repaid by the municipalities charging recipients of the water or users of the infrastructure for the service that was being provided. Vance attended the official groundbreaking of the Lake Huron pipeline to supply water at Grand Bend. This was on the 4th of September, 1964. There he's speaking, and for those of you from London, yes, that taller microphone is a CFPL radio station microphone. Ontario Premier John Robarts turned the sod in the presence of London Mayor Gordon Stronach, other dignitaries and visitors. 3 years later, on the 27th of June, 1967, the system delivered the first water to the City of London's facilities at Arva. Vance also attended the dedication ceremony at Grand Bend on the 27th of September, 1968, where he introduces Charles S. McNaughton, Treasurer of Ontario and Minister of Economics. So this system now supplies, it was twinned some years ago, and it now supplies most of the water in the part of the world where I live in southwestern Ontario. In 1959, Newfoundland engineer Tom Cairns proposed the Great Replenishment and Northern Development, or GRAND, canal scheme. It proposed constructing a dam across the mouth of James Bay, which you can see in the figure on the screen, and using controlled discharges at low tides, making James Bay into a huge freshwater lake. The freshwater would then be pumped over the Arctic watershed to feed the Great Lakes system, and from there, arid regions of the American South and Southwest. 5 Ontario rivers would be impacted: the Severn, Winisk, Attawapiskat, Albany, and Moose Rivers. This scheme is dormant, but it isn't dead. So in 1965, perhaps in response to the scheme, the Ontario Water Resources Commission initiated a special assignment to inventory the water resources of Northern Ontario and link the economic potentialities of the area with these resources. Vance notes that, quote, with senior staff members, I visited Northern Ontario a couple of times each year in departments of lands and forests aircrafts. We visited such places as Fort Severn and Winisk on Hudson's Bay, Fort Albany and Moosonee on James Bay, Red Lake, Pickle Lake, and other places. I visited a few of those sites while a youth canoe tripper, and they remain quite remote. The late 1960s were perhaps the first time water pollution, particularly in the Great Lakes Basin, was taken seriously. Maybe some on the call remember these days. This was a time when rivers in America were so polluted that they were catching fire, and 20-mile-long fires were devastating in the process. This is a 1960 photograph of a team inspecting the St. Clair River. Vance, shown on the left, is in his mid-70s when this photograph was taken. Vance was also active in the Canadian Forestry Association, serving as its president in the late 1930s and chairman of the board in the mid-1950s. He was an active mover in the formation of the Ontario branch of the Canadian Forestry Association and president in the early 50s. Quote, his work in this branch has resulted in effective educational campaigns now extending to some 1 million persons each year in conservation and forest fire protection. In 1956, he became the fourth recipient of Canada's highest conservation award, the Julian Crandall Trophy, presented annually by the Canadian Tourist Association to the Canadian citizen who is judged to have contributed most to the conservation of Canada's renewable natural resources, soil, forest, and water. So to sum up, James Alfred Vance was clearly a hard-working and extremely accomplished individual who made significant contributions to the engineering profession. He seems to have a remarkable variety of professional and personal interests. He successfully operated his father's construction company for almost half a century, and yet was awarded the Julian Crandall Trophy in 1956 in recognition of his championing of sustainable forestry practices. He played a very major role in the founding of the Faculty of Engineering Science at the University of Western Ontario. I owe my retirement income to this guy. He served usually as chairman as a great number of community-minded committees in Woodstock, and he was, in the words of Western's president G. Edward Hall, a man who finds time to do fine things for others. So this photograph, taken in 1950 when he became president of the Engineering Institute of Canada, taken by Yusuf Karsh, really captures the fellow. And clearly he's worthy of recognition through both the CSCE Vance Award and actually the Vance Medal, which is given to the graduating student with the highest average in Western's Department of Civil and Environmental Engineering. So I'd like to acknowledge Keith Stevens, who's in the audience, for sharing his grandfather's autobiography with me. I'd like to acknowledge Western Archives and Regional Collection, who were very helpful in providing free press photographs from their collection of negatives. And of course, I've got a terrific spouse who puts up with me. So happy to try to answer any questions you may have. We'll stop sharing the screen and turn things over.
Thank you very much, Kevin and Mike, for this excellent and very interesting presentation. We have a few minutes for our presenters to answer your questions. Please use the Q&A feature of Zoom to submit your questions to us. Okay, so let me start with the question on Sanderson. So that would be you, Kevin. Which of the achievements by A.B. Sanderson really stand out to you?
Well, what really strikes me about A.B. Sanderson is the massive amount of accomplishment his firm achieved within the first 5 years of forming the company. If you make a list of all the achievements that they completed and undertook in that period of time, it really just blows my mind. It's just looking at my list here, like the Agassiz-Rosedale Bridge, the design and construction of the Nelson Big Orange Bridge, the pre-stressed girder spans for the Second Narrows Bridge, the advisor to the Royal Commission on the collapse of Second Narrows, the chair of the Board of Engineers on the collapse and reconstruction of the Peace River Bridge at Taylor, the design of the Alexandra Bridge steel arch, design of Point Ellis Bridge girder superstructure, several other railway and roadway bridges, and the professional connections that he made with some of the leading engineers in bridge engineering and geotech at the time. And he accomplished this all, within the first 5 years of his company. And those achievements are still, in many of them, those bridges are still in service today. And he really did open up the province of BC with the work that he did. Hard to imagine that they really accomplished so many things in 5 years. That's what really blows my mind.
Okay, excellent. Also, from your presentation, Kevin, can you expand on Sanderson's views on the use of computers for engineering work? I know you did mention that in your presentation.
The impression that I get is that he really was a math wizard. I think one of his terms was like mathematics doesn't lie. You know, he really wanted to show things mathematically, and given that sort of background, he really gave a lot of thought to the use of computers and what computers could be used for. And he, that list of papers that I had in my presentation, one of them was a paper entitled Use of Computation in Structural Design. So he wrote an 18-page paper in 1956 on the use of computation in structural design. And so he gave that a lot of thought, and he had some thoughts on how computers might help engineers, describes it in that paper. I'm just going to read a couple of paragraphs out of that. He said, "The computer is still too new to say very definitively how it can best be used. But from the point of view of the structural or civil engineer, I feel the answer is twofold. In the first place, it will enable us to refine our present designs, and in the second place, it will make possible the design of a whole new class of structures, which today we would avoid because the design would be too lengthy." His conclusion was, "In conclusion, I would like to say that I feel quite sure in my own mind that electronic computation is here to stay, and that we might as well make up our minds to learn to use it now as later. I believe that if a designer had worked in an office where electronic computation was used, he would have a very difficult time getting used to working in a different office without a computer. It would be as if you had taken away his slide rule. He could still do the work, but he would not be happy." So that's in 1958. That's quite impressive, given the time.
Quite futuristic for the time.
Sorry, just to jump in, the other thing, Kevin, that's a really nice. I think that Sanderson's enthusiasm for mathematics and computation is probably one of the reasons why Sanderson and P.L. Prattley hit it off, because P.L. Prattley was also very advanced in doing sophisticated calculations of arch bridge deformations during construction so that they could make the ends meet in the middle of the span and things like that. And I'm sure one of the reasons why Sanderson was kind of Prattley's agent in Western Canada was that they just would have intuitively shared that appreciation for the power of mathematics and structural engineering. Sorry, Ali, I cut you off.
Yeah, no, thank you. Thank you, Mike and Kevin. What do you think drove James Vance to become so accomplished in such diverse areas?
The diversity is something that I can't really answer. I think he was probably a very curious individual, and he would get interested in things. And I do think that, and I should be a little careful how I phrase this, but he had a very challenging early life. I mean, imagine being a third-year university student and suddenly having to take over your father's business and actually also be the eldest male, taking over the family and looking after the family. And I don't think he had much choice about this. He had to be very efficient, and reading his autobiography a bit, you know, he was running his dad's company through the 20s and 30s in Woodstock, and that would have been difficult at times for sure. So I think it was kind of this collection of circumstances that was part of his early life that really kind of, whether he wanted to go there or not, that's where he had to go, because those were the cards that he was dealt.
So how did he transition? I know he's a prolific person, but how did he transition from construction and contracting to supporting and directing environmental initiatives? And that's quite early, you know, in those days.
Yeah. So there's a couple of things there to think about, I think. One is he was a sportsman. He was an avid hunter and fisher. And he and some of his colleagues had some property on the Spanish River in northern Ontario, which they used for duck hunting and other things like that. And there was a pulp company that was polluting the river, and he and his friends successfully took the pulp company to court, winning at the regular court level and then the Ontario Supreme Court, and I think they might have even gone to the Supreme Court of Canada. The government of Ontario changed the rules so that this pulp mill could continue to pollute the river, but I think his sensitivity to environmental issues might have started with that. I haven't been able to talk about his engagement with a whole bunch of different businesses in Woodstock, particularly rural telephone companies, but all kinds of other businesses. And I think he was a guy who, when he put his mind to doing something, had a very high standard of what he was trying to do and consistently met the standard. So I do believe that he was his contributions to forestry would suggest that he was quite aware of the importance of forestry to the Canadian economy and the importance of sustainable forestry and those kinds of things.
Okay, excellent. Very good. Okay, so now we are 4 minutes to 2. Let's begin to wrap things up. We'll start by warmly thanking Kevin and Mike for their excellent presentation and great answers to the questions. See you tomorrow and have a good day in the meantime.
CSCE National Tech Talk webinars are intended solely to provide information. The views expressed during the webinar are those of the presenters and do not necessarily represent the views and opinions of the Canadian Society for Civil Engineering. Attendees of most live CSCE National Tech Talk webinars are eligible to receive a certificate crediting them with 1 professional development hour. Tech Talk webinars are free for CSCE members in good standing. Visit the events menu at csce.ca for more information.